It is with great honor. My name is Aisyah, and this is my colleague,
Muhammad Iqbal Nazwar,
as the master of ceremony of today's session.
We would like to welcome you in our campus, UIN Sunan Ampel, Surabaya, in the 22nd ISIS 2023. You are now at Kiai Haji Saifuddin Zuhri building.
Today, we will be having 2 plenary sessions, which are the 3rd and 4th plenary.
The 3rd plenary session will discuss about how Maqashid al-syariah can be the basis of Fiqh in the society. The theme for this plenary is Maqashid al-syariah as a reference and framework of Fiqh for humanity.
Joining us today in our session, Chair is Professor Siti Aisyah, MA, PhD.
And over the next 2 hours, she will guide us through a productive and engaging discussion.
Kepada Profesor Siti Aisyah, MA, PhD, kami persilakan.
And let us welcome our 2 distinguished speakers for the 3rd plenary session. Attending here with us, Professor Masud Badrin, please come on stage.
Last but not the least, we have Kiai Haji Afifuddin Muhajir. Kepada Kiai Haji Afifuddin Muhajir, dipersilakan.
Cek. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, participants, speakers, Rector from State Islamic University, and good morning, Prof. Masud. Thank you for coming. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alamin, salatu wassalam ala syarafil anbiya musallin, wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in, amma ba'd. Today is the 3rd plenary session for us, and the title of this session related to Maqashid al-syariah as a reference and framework of Fiqh for humanity. Actually, we have 3 speakers today. Unfortunately, the speaker from Turkey is unable to present due to traveling problems. So today we just have 2 speakers. Okay, well, let's start with a statement before I hand over to Prof. Masud. We acknowledge that Islam is peaceful and inclusive religion as rahmatan lil alamin, and this have been clearly stated both in the Quran and Hadith. Maqashid al-syariah promotes human dignity. The key question is how to prove this concern, and who has an authority to interpret Islamic teachings, and are there any challenges to achieve this? So this is essential question then will arise on this session. We have today Professor Masud Badrin, PhD, and before he presents his paper, I would like to introduce a little bit about his CV. He studies public international law, international humanitarian law, international criminal law, international human rights law, organizational law international, and collective security law. He is a teacher he is a professor in Islamic law in the Department of Law in the University of London. So he is very grateful to be with us today. One of his books is Islamic Law, a very short introduction. Now he is going to present his paper entitled Maqashid al-syariah as a basis for the Fiqh for human rights in Islamic law. Please welcome Professor Masud.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulih al-Kareem. Al-Mab'uth rahmatan lil Alameen. Professor Siti Aisha, thank you so much for that kind introduction. Thank you. And I will stand on the normal protocols by saying salam to all the leaders here and also all members of the audience. I also must start by thanking the university for inviting me to participate in this very important conference. I think, it's very, very important that Muslim scholars need to address this issue regarding how Islam and Islamic law responds to contemporary issues. Before I start with my paper, I have a PowerPoint which I'll be referring to. I've met a few people, since my arrival here, and I think I have a moral duty to acknowledge them and to thank them. People in Indonesia are very nice people, but the few people who have been around me since I came have been really, really extra nice. I want to thank publicly Siti Fitri Asad. She has really been very, very kind to me, looking after me, booking my tickets and everything. And also Dr. Ahmed Room. He has really been very, very kind, looking after me. So I thought I should mention these two people and thank them. Jazakumullahu khair jazak. Now the title of my paper is Maqashid al-Sharia as a basis of fiqh for human rights in Islamic law. Now, we find out that, this conference, the theme of the conference, I consider it as a big challenge to Muslim jurists and Muslim scholars, not only for Indonesia, but globally. Because of the fact that there are so many contemporary issues that poses challenge to Islam, which Islamic law needs to respond to. That is, if Islamic law must be seen as practicable. And one of these challenges is the question of human rights. Now you find out that in the first slide, I identify that the theme of the conference creates an existential Islamic jurisprudential challenge. If you're able to read it, I have a quote there from the concept note of the conference, which indicates that, Muslim countries or Muslims across the world face so many complex challenges, and therefore there's a need. Reference is made to the description of the Prophet as rahmatan lil alameen, wa ma arsalnaka illa rahmatan lil alameen, and that should be a foundation I described this incidentally. I've just written a paper on the description of the Prophet as rahmatan lil alameen. And I argue that, this actually indicates what I consider to be al-maqsad al-asli, that is the fundamental objective of sending the Prophet, is that he is to be a mercy for humanity. Therefore, when we are interpreting any of the message of the Prophet, either from the Quran or from the Sunnah, it must not contradict that maqsad al-asli, that is rahmatan lil alameen. Any interpretation of the sources must be consistent with the concept of rahmatan lil alameen. And therefore, I believe that Maqasid Sharia provides an opportunity for us to reflect over this. Next slide, please. Now, next slide. Now, I want to start by reminding us, maybe we may not reflect over this, that Islamic law, I consider it as an equitable balance in the hands of human beings. Even though the sources of Islamic law, particularly the Quran, are divine, but the implementation of this is in the hands of human beings. It is not Allah or God who descends to implement the law. It is in our hands, and it is like a balance. And I've put in some, symbolic photos there. You see the hands of human beings and the balance of law placed on it. And there are various references in the Quran and the Sunnah. I'll be making a lot of references to the Quran and the Sunnah because of the fact that when we talk about Maqasid Sharia, it's a concept, it's a principle. It does not live in an abstract. It has to be based on the sources for it to be acceptable. Now, if we look at Islamic law as an equitable balance, you find a lot of verses in the Quran referring to this. Actually, Quran chapter 57, verse 25, which is the first one quoted there. The Quran indicates that certainly we send the messengers with clear explanations, and we send down with them the book and the balance, al-mizan. That is the law. Allah indicates clearly in the Quran, لَقَدْ أَرْسَلْنَا رُسُلَنَا بِالْبَيِّنَاتِ وَأَنزَلْنَا مَعَهُمْ الْمِيزَانِ. And we gave them the balance, which is the law, so that they can be able to uphold equity on earth. You find so many verses. If you look in Surah Al-Rahman particularly, it indicates clearly, and do not be excessive in respect of the balance, and uphold the balance with equity, and do not be deficient in the balance. Ahlan. So we are able to see that in Surah Al-Rahman, when we talk about implementing the law, implementing Islamic law, the Mizan, in Surah Al-Rahman, Quran chapter 55, verses 8 to 9, it says, Allah tatgaw fil Mizan. Do not be excessive in implementing the balance. Wa aqimul wazna bil qist. Uphold the balance in equity. Wala tukhsirul mizan. And do not be deficient in the balance. So you find out that, in the middle, it puts the concept of equity, qist. So it indicates clearly that anytime we want to apply Islamic law, it must be applied with equity in order to achieve the purpose of sending the Prophet, which is for him to be a mercy for the whole of humanity. I've quoted some other verses there indicating that Islamic law should be implemented in an equitable way as an equitable balance. Next slide, please. Now, the concept of rahmatan lil alameen is very, very important in that regard. You know, as I did mention earlier, I just wrote a paper on this, which is cited on the screen there, you know, which is titled Prophet Muhammad as a mercy for the world. I looked at this in the concept of, in relation to, the offense of blasphemy, particularly in relation to Pakistan, and also the need for following due process of law. You find that in many Muslim majority countries, including my country, Nigeria, actually, in northern Nigeria, you find out that, the concept of blasphemy is usually used, you know, in a very, very, aggressive way, whereby individuals can just accuse somebody that they have blasphemed against the Prophet, and without going through due process of law, they attack them by themselves. I do argue strongly in that article that this is not in consonance with the Maqashid al-Asli, that is the fundamental description of the Prophet as Rahmatan lil Alameen. You know, even if you accuse somebody, it has to go through due process of law. People should not take laws into their hands, and that is not how best to address Islamic law. So the concept of Rahmatan lil Alameen is very, very important in that regard. I know I have a very short time, so I'll be going through this very, very quickly. Now, next slide, please. Now, the need to find ways by promoting the equitable application of Islamic law, particularly through Maqashid al-Sharia, is not new. You find out that, when we talk about Islamic law, a lot of people sometimes think that Islamic law is jamid, that is, it is conservative, that it doesn't evolve. Anybody who knows the history of Islamic law will be able to appreciate that Islamic law has evolved over time. In a book on Introduction to Islamic Law, which published, which was published by the OUP in 2022, I indicated that the growth of Islamic law can be classified into about 6 periods. You know, we have the formative period during the time of the Prophet, then pre-classical period during the time of Khulafa or Rashidin. You find out that even during the time of Khulafa or Rashidin, there were a lot of changes in relation to how Islamic law is applied, different from the time of the Prophet, because the Prophet was not there any longer. After the period of Khulafa or Rashidin, we came into the classical period, which was the longest period of the development of Islamic law, about 600 years, you know, during the Abbasid and Umayyad period. And you find out that Islamic law evolved in various ways. You know, many of the principles that we are talking about today evolved at that time. Then we have the post-classical period, then the modern period. I argue that, most of the debates that we are having particularly relates to the fact that Islamic law is entering what I call a postmodern period, whereby we know that, because of some atrocious interpretations of Islamic law by organizations like ISIS, Boko Haram in my country, Nigeria, Islamic law and Islam is challenged globally. And therefore, many contemporary scholars, using the concept of Maqashid al-Sharia, the concept of Maslaha, the concept of the Prophet being described as Rahmatan lil Alameen, are trying as much as possible to counter that hostile ideology, you know, that are being promoted by different, organizations. So you find out that, the need to do this perhaps indicates that scholars and jurists of Islam are trying as much as possible to move Islamic law to meet the needs of the time. Next slide, please. So having laid the foundation about the fact that Islamic law is not static, it evolves over time. You know, the history of it is that it has evolved over time, and it is evolving into postmodernism now. because of the challenges that we are facing in modern times. And one of the main challenges is human rights. Human rights is a global challenge. You know, not only a challenge to Islam and Islamic law, but to the whole world. You find that because when we talk about human rights, it has a very strong moral and legal appeal. You know, anybody wants their human rights to be respected. You want to enjoy your right to life. You want to enjoy your right to free speech. You want to enjoy prohibition from torture. So you find out the concept of human rights has a global appeal. And therefore, it creates a very big challenge to every country today. And many Muslim countries have signed on to many human rights instruments. Therefore, they have international obligations to fulfill this. But you find out that many Muslim majority countries, you know, a lot of the time, in fulfilling their obligations, human rights obligations, sometimes they make excuses based on the Sharia. They will say that because of the Sharia, they cannot respect women's rights. Because of the Sharia, they cannot do this. In my writings, I challenge that in the sense that an equitable application of Islamic law must actually facilitate the fulfillment of human rights obligations. So human rights is quite a very important challenge. Next slide, please. Now you find out that if you look at human rights and Islamic law, there are three main perspectives. There are some scholars and countries who see the relationship between human rights and Islamic law as adversarial. That is, you know, contradictory. That is, well, human rights and Islamic law cannot be compatible. The second perspective is the harmonistic one. That is, human rights and Islamic law can be harmonized. And the third perspective is what we call the double-edged. And the double-edged perspective is that the problem is not about human rights, it's not about Islamic law, but it's about human beings, that is those who interpret them. So it is double-edged. You can interpret any law equitably or non-equitably. So it depends on who is interpreting in that regard. Now, coming to Maqashid al-Sharia, my own writings and my own arguments promote the possible harmonization of human rights and Islamic law. And Maqashid al-Sharia can be used as a framework to achieve that. I first made this point, I first made reference to Maqashid al-Sharia and Maslaha as possible principles of reconciling or harmonizing between human rights norms and Islamic law in Muslim majority countries as early as, year 2000, and this conference actually now gave me the opportunity to reflect over how to theoretically identify the real framework. Yesterday, I think one of the speakers here was talking about the fact that academics need to come up with a theoretical framework of how Maqashid al-Sharia can be used. And this is what perhaps maybe quickly I will do in the last part of this presentation now. Now, Maqashid al-Sharia, and you find out that many classical and contemporary scholars, even Ibn Taymiyyah, amongst the classical scholars and some contemporary scholars like Muhammad Hashim Kamali, late Sheikh Yusuf Qaradawi, I've mentioned many of them that they have actually argued that the scope of Maqashid al-Sharia can be expanded, beyond the 5 main daruriyat that were identified by Ash-Shatibi. And based on that, particularly Sheikh Yusuf Qaradawi was arguing that the scope could be expanded actually to include the protection of fundamental freedoms, protection of the rights of people, and especially the minorities. So you find out that, one will be able to find evidences, both in classical and contemporary writings, recognizing Maqashid al-Sharia as a framework. Now, if we understand Maqashid al-Sharia in context, next slide please, we'll be able to appreciate that what Maqashid al-Sharia does is to distinguish between text and context. Text and context. You find out that a lot of the time, Islamic law, the sources need to be interpreted. And they can be interpreted either literally or contextually. When they are interpreted literally, sometimes it could create problems in relation to literal interpretation. So what Maqashid al-Sharia promotes is that the sources should be interpreted contextually, based on the object and purpose of the revelations. Now, next slide. I don't know whether you can see this well. Next slide, please. I have provided, next slide, next one. I've provided a sort of, a chart of Islamic law in context. I may not go through that, and I've put in, you find out that, Maqashid al-Sharia, the role of Maqashid al-Sharia, the base of it, at the bottom, whereby you have the sources, the Quran and the Sunnah at the top, you have ijma and qiyas as part of fiqh, and the principles Maqashid al-Sharia comes there, and you find that, zuruf, the mujtahid is there to interpret both the Sharia and fiqh and also the principles. But he has to interpret them based on circumstances, as zuruf. And by doing that, the mujtahid is required to do that within the context of the object and purpose of revelation. Now, because of time, I may not be able to go through this much, but I try to provide this in the form of an illustration. Next slide, please. Now, a lot of the time, people might feel that, well, we are stuck with classical interpretations. That is, yesterday I think one of the participants was talking about the fact that the problem is that here, even in Malaysia here, the books of fiqh are the classical ones that people continue to go through and things like that, as if we are stuck with that. Islamic law changes, the ahkam can change with change of circumstances. And even if you look in the Quran, I gave you an example here, what I call Islamic or divine legal realism. Islamic law is a realist system of law that responds to the reality, the practical realities of time. And I quote two verses to support this. If you look in Surah Al-Anfal, Quran chapter 8, verses 65 and 66, indicates this clearly. In verse 65, the Quran states clearly, Allah was telling the Prophet, Allah says, Ya ayyuhan Nabi, O Prophet, harrid al-mu'minina ala al-qital, encourage the Muslims to warfare when they are confronted by the enemy. And he said, and Allah says, in yakun minkum ishuruna sabirun yaglibu mi'atain. That is, if they have 20 patient, committed soldiers, they will defeat 200. You find out that, that's the first. So the first principle was that Allah promised a ratio of 1 to 10. That if you have 20 people, they will defeat 200. But when the circumstances changed, in ayah 66, Allah says that, Al-an, but now, khafafallahu ankum. Allah wants to make things easy for you because your circumstances have changed. Because your circumstances have changed, Allah says, alima anna fikum da'fa. Allah knows that there's weakness in you now. Because there's weakness in you, fa in yakum minkum mi'ah, if you have 500 people, yaglibu mi'atayn. They can only defeat 200. So it becomes 1 to 2. It moves from the previous 1 to 10 to 1 to 2 because of changes in circumstances. So if you look at, and there are many verses in the Quran like that. If you look at it from that point of view, that even Allah in His revelation changes, the rule of the ahkam based on the changes of circumstances. So anybody who understands that will be able to appreciate that Islamic law is not static. It responds to realities of time in relation to our ahkam. And you find out that, there's a qaida, there's a maxim that says, La yunkat tagayyur al-ahkam bitagayyur al-azman. That is, there's nothing that says that the rules cannot change when things change. Now, next slide, please. Next slide. Now, to have a theoretical methodological framework, we need to classify Maqashid al-Sharia. And it can be classified in various ways. Looking in the books, I've identified 4 main classifications. Maqashid can be classified in relation to hierarchy. It can be classified in relation to the hierarchy. And this is what a lot of people talk about. In relation to hierarchy, the classification is divided into 3. We have the daruriyat, the hajiyat, and the tahsiniyat. This is in relation to hierarchy. And the daruriyat relates to protection of life, religion, family, and property. But there are other classifications. In relation to scope, it is also classified into 3. What we call al-maqasid al-amma, that is the general maqasid, which covers, that is the scope of the maqasid, can cover general things. Then we have the al-maqasid al-khassa, that is particular maqasid, that covers particular subjects. Then we have the al-maqasid al-juz'iyya, that is the partial maqasid that covers partial issues. Then in relation to the purpose, we have what we call the maqasid al-asliyya, that is the fundamental maqasid, and al-maqasid tabi'iyya, that is complementary maqasid. And in relation to its validation, we have al-maqasid qat'iyya, specific maqasid that you find evidence for in the Quran. And we have al-maqasid zanniya, that is rational. Looking at things from a rational point of view, we can also, so based on these 4 classifications, one can identify a methodology, a clear methodology for maqasid for human rights. And this is what I want to do now quickly. Now, next slide. Next one, because of time. Next one again, okay. Now, towards a maqasid methodological framework. To have a methodological framework for maqasid, I argue that there must be 2 steps, particularly in relation to human rights. The first step is to establish a general concept of human rights in relation to the scope, the general scope of maqasid. And if we look in the Quran, you'll be able to see specific, clear text, which we can call al-maqasid al-qat'iyya. Specifically, that can authenticate the general concept of human rights. One of them is the ayah we have been quoting, وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَاكَ إِلَّا رَحْمَةً لِلْعَالَمِينَ. That indicates that Islam is about mercifulness, and human rights is about mercifulness. And yesterday, the other ayah was recited a lot, وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. We have honored the progeny of Adam, that all human beings are honored. That's general scope for maqasid. And there are so many ayats in the Quran in relation to that, which I've stated there, which because of time, I may not be able to point to. And you find also provisions in the ahadith on this. Next slide. We can also use istiqra', inductive reasoning, to be able to also justify the general principles of the Sharia. Then after that, we go to the second step, which is to identify the Maqashid al-Khasa, specific human rights norms. For example, women's rights. Next slide. I give example of women's rights. And you find out that, we can find specific provisions in the Quran, Khasa, specifically talking about women, that their rights must be promoted. For example, Quran 9:71 talk about the fact that believing men and believing women, ba'aduhum awliya ba'd, that is, they are helpers of one another. And you find many provisions of the Quran. For example, it says, your wives, hunna libasun lakum wa antum libasun lahunna. You know, they are garments for you, you are garments for them. The Prophet said in traditions that an-nisa shiqaqul rijal. That is, so you find so many provisions that specifically talk about the fact that women's rights is generally recognized. Then after that, you then move to juz'i, the second step, whereby if it is necessary on particular issues, now for example, in relation to Maqashid al-Juz'iyya, we can use that to argue specific rights like maybe women's right to work. You know, a woman's right to work. Juz'iyya, one can find evidences in the Quran to indicate that yes, women have a right to work. Because Allah says they should pay zakah. If they don't work, they cannot pay zakat. Their husband can inherit them. When they die and leave property, their husband can inherit them. If they don't work, they cannot have property. So you have provisions, juz'iyya, to be able to also justify some specific rights for women. I also give examples of rights of minorities. Second slide, next slide. You'll be able to find textual evidences for minorities. Then you'll be able to find also specific provisions, juz'iyya, in relation to specific rights of minorities. That's why do we need to protect them? And you find various verses in the Quran on this. Then fair trial, I also give examples of fair trial and due process, which also follow these two steps. First, you establish the general provisions that support these rights, and then the partial provisions to also support specific provisions. Now to conclude, next slide. Next slide, please. In concluding, my perspective is using Maqashid al-Sharia, using this framework, you know, the two-step framework of using Maqashid al-Amma and Maqashid al-Khasa, and when necessary, using Maqashid al-Juz'iyya, you know, it becomes possible to find a harmonization between human rights and Islamic law in various forms. And the Quran indicates this clearly. If you look in Quran chapter 5 verse 2, Allah says, وَتَعَاوَنُوا عَلَى الْبِرِّ وَالتَّقْوَى. Cooperate in goodness and righteousness. And human rights is about goodness, it's about mercifulness, you know, and therefore you find evidences to support it. But to be able to do that, we need a moderate, contextual, and appropriate interpretation of the Sharia. You know, we need a contextual and moderate interpretation of the Sharia in order to be able to assure this. The PowerPoint will be available. I know I've jumped over a few things, you know, because of time constraints, but I hope I've made the point that Maqashid al-Sharia can really help to ensure that human rights are able to be harmonized with Islamic law wherever Islamic law applies. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you so much from Mahmoud. Thank you for your progressive thought and clear and very brief explanation for that. And allow me to speak in bahasa. Bapak Ibu sekalian, para peserta yang kami hormati, beliau Prof. Maqashid sudah menjelaskan secara detail tentang bagaimana kemungkinan dan keharusan akan harmonisasi hukum Islam dengan human rights, dengan HAM. Jadi beliau menjelaskan juga dengan detail. Ada hal yang sangat penting dalam catatan kita adalah ada general scope of maqasid. Jadi ada maqasid yang bersifat umum, ada maqasid yang bersifat khusus, dan semuanya itu endingnya adalah bagaimana mendukung, mendorong, dan mengharmonisasi hukum Islam dengan HAM tadi. Itu tergantung kepada Bapak Ibu sebagai akademisi, sebagai peneliti untuk menunjukkan bahwa itu terjadi harmonisasi. Saya kira itu poin penting dari beliau. Dan selanjutnya sudah hadir di tengah-tengah kita adalah Pak Kiai Haji Dr. Honoris Causa Afifuddin Muhajir. Terima kasih Pak Kiai sudah hadir bersama kita. Beliau juga nanti akan menjelaskan bagaimana posisi Maqashid syariah yang akan dipakai sebagai referensi, sebagai basis dalam mengakomodir tadi kesetaraan dan kesetaraan dan keadilan, dan dalam rangka memanusiakan manusia. Saya kira itu nanti beliau adalah ahli di bidang itu. Sebelumnya saya kira tidak perlu saya jelaskan atau memperkenalkan siapa beliau di hadapan kita, tapi paling tidak beliau adalah orang yang sangat terkenal di Indonesia ini, bahkan dunia. Tapi saya ingin menjelaskan sedikit bahwa beliau adalah pengasuh dari Pondok Pesantren Salafiyah Syafiyah Situbondo. Beliau memiliki catatan atau karya ilmiah yang sangat banyak, di antara lain adalah karya fungsionalisasi usul fikih dalam Bahsul Masail Nahdlatul Ulama, kritik nalar fikih NU, metodologi kajian fikih, maslahah sebagai cita pembentukan hukum Islam. Saya kira beliau sangat relevan untuk menyampaikan kepada kita ide-ide tentang maslahah mursalah sebagai landasan utama di dalam isu-isu kemanusiaan. Dengan hormat kami persilakan pada Pak Kiai.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Wassalatu wassalamu ala asyrafil anbiya'i wal mursalin Sayyidina Muhammadin sallallahu alaihi wasallam wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in, amma ba'du. Al-mukarramin ayyuhal hudur wa akhusu bil dzikri al-ustaz al-doktor Mashhud Badrin. Dari mana? Ana rajulun Indonesiun Madurian. Walakin fi hadhihi nadwa la atakallam bil Indonesia wala bil Maduriyah. Li'annani qad katabtu maqalati bil lughati al-arabiyyah. Walakin saati insyaallah bi ba'di tafsir lima kana khafiyan min kalimati fi hadhihi al-maqalah. Tujiba minni an atakallama haula maudhi bina'u i'adatu bina'i al-fiqhi lil musawat al-insiyah. Wa hadhihi al-kalimatu tus'iru bi anna tajdid al-fiqhi daruriyun li al-musawat al-insaniyah. Ma'a anna al-musawat al-insaniyah mabda'un min mabadi'il Islam al-asasiyah. Saya diminta untuk berbicara tentang rekonstruksi fikih dalam rangka kesetaraan manusia. Judul ini mengesankan bahwa seolah-olah keniscayaan melakukan rekonstruksi terhadap fikih dalam rangka kesetaraan manusia. Padahal sesungguhnya kesetaraan itu merupakan prinsip dasar daripada agama Islam, jadi tak perlu tajdid fikih. Wa ja'altu maqalatihi hadhihi bimasaba kitabin aqra'uhu kulla yawmin fi ma'had al-musawat al-insaniyah wassalam al-mustadam fi syariatil islamiyah. كان العالم توشاه ظلمات التمييز بين الإنسان والإنسان في فترات طويلة من الزمن، ولم يعرف العالم شرقه وغربه أن للإنسان كرامة إنسانية، كرامة أساسية تقتضي مساواة الإنسان بعضه لبعض، حتى إذا صدر الإعلان العالمي لحقوق الإنسان وذلك سنة 1948 تنبهوا لذلك. وقد ورد فيه ما يلي: لكل إنسان حق التمتع بجميع الحقوق والحريات المذكورة في هذا الإعلان دون ما تمييز من أي نوع، ولا سيما بسبب العنصر أو اللون أو الجنس أو اللغة أو الدين أو الرأي السياسي وغير السياسي. وقبل ذلك كان العالم والغرب بصفة خاصة في ظلمة ظلمة وجهالة جهلة، وكانت العنصرية حية في كثير من أنحاء المعمورة. وفي الولايات الأمريكية المتحدة أعطي الأمريكيون البيض امتيازات وحقوقا انحصرت بهم فقط دونا عن كل الأعراق الأخرى. ويعتبر ترشيح باراك أوباما للرئاسة في القرن 21 كأول رئيس أسود للولايات المتحدة دليلا على دخول الأمة في عصر جديد، عصر ما بعد العنصرية. وأما الإسلام فكانت المساواة الإنسانية مبدأ من مبادئه الأساسية، وقررها من خلال نصوصه الواضحة الصريحة. لقد صدق غوستاف لوبون الفيلسوف والمؤرخ الفرنسي إذ قال: إن حضارة العرب المسلمين قد أدخلت الأمم الأوروبية الوحشية في عالم الإنسانية، ولقد كان العرب أساتذتنا. هذه كان قال الغربي. وقال أيضا: إن العرب هم الذين علموا العالم كيف تتفق حرية الفكر مع استقامة الدين. جعل الإسلام الناس سواسية كأسنان المشط، لا يفرق بين عنصر وعنصر، وبين قوم وبين قوم، وبين لون ولين، مسقطا كل أنواع التفرقة القبلية والعنصرية والقومية واللونية. يا أيها الذين آمنوا، يقول القرآن الكريم: يا أيها الناس إنا خلقناكم من ذكر وأنثى وجعلناكم شعوبا وقبائل لتعارفوا إن أكرمكم عند الله أتقاكم. وقد قرر النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم مبدأ المساواة في خطبته في حجة الوداع في أواسط أيام التشريق، فقال: يا أيها الناس ألا إن ربكم واحد وإن أباكم واحد، ألا لا فضل لعربي على عجمي ولا لعجمي على عربي ولا أحمر على أسود ولا أسود على أحمر إلا بالتقوى. أبلغت؟ قالوا: بلغ رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. وقد قال سبحانه وتعالى: فاستجاب لهم ربهم أني لا أضيع عمل عامل منكم من ذكر أو أنثى بعضكم من بعض. بهذا قرر الإسلام المساواة بين الرجل والمرأة في الحقوق والواجبات، muwazza'atan bihasbi fitratillahi allati fadara kullan minar rijali wan nisa fa inna mimma la yaqbalu an-niza'a anna kullan minar rajuli wal mar'ati kullun minhuma khasa'isu yaktalifu an khasa'isil akhar anna bainar rajuli wal mar'ati ikhtilafan fil khasa'is yaktadi al-ikhtilafa fil wadha'if wal maraqis wala yatahaqqaqu at-takamul alladhi aradahu Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala fi khalqihi illa bi bara'ati hadzal ikhtilaf wa akhdhihi bi 'ainil i'tibar wal musawatu la ta'ni at-tasawi al-mutlaq fa inna bainahuma farqan hunaka farqun baina al-musawat wat tasawi al-musawatu tuqsadu biha al-adalatu al-mabniyatu ala ikhtilafil khasa'is allati yanfaridu biha kullun min adh-dhakari wal unsa wa amma at-tasawi fayu'na bihi anna ar-rajula yakunu kal mar'ah wa anna al-mar'ah takunu karrajul mi'atan bil mi'ah wa qaulun nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam innaman nisa'u saqa'iqur rijal. Qala Ibnul Athir saqa'ir rijal saqa'iqur rijal ayna dha'iruhum wa amsaluhum ka'annahunna syukikna minhum wa li'anna Hawwa'a khuliqat min Adam alaihi salatu wassalam wa saqiqur rajuli akhuhu li abihi wa ummihi li'annahu syukka nasabuhu min nasabihi. Wa ata al-islamu likulli ahadin lahu mu'ahhadatun fursatan mutakafi'atan li an yatawalla amrul muslimin aw yataqallad aw yamansibin wa awjab alaihim sam'ahu wa ta'atahu walau kana abadan minal abid. Ruya an Yahya ibn Husainin qala sami'tu jaddati taqulu Sami'tu jaddati tuhaddithu anna Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam yaqulu anna Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam yaqulu sami'tu an-nabiy sallallahu alaihi wasallam yaktubu fi hajjatil wada' wa huwa yaqulu law istu'mila alaikum abdun yaqudukum bi kitabillahi fasma'u wa lahu wa'ti'u. Wa lam yaktafi al-islamu bi takriri mabda'il musawati nadhariyan wa tabaqahu amaliyan. Artinya tentang kesetaraan manusia bukan semata-mata bersifat teori akan tetapi langsung praktek. Salah satu buktinya adalah faqad kana sayyiduna Bilal bin Rabah radhiyallahu anhu abadan habasyian a'taqahu sayyiduna Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radhiyallahu anhu thumma kana yatabawwa'u makanatan adiyatan fil Islam haitsu ikhtarahu an-nabiy sallallahu alaihi wasallam liyakuna muadzinahu al-awwal. Bilal bin Rabah radhiyallahu anhu adalah seorang budak hitam. Beliau adalah salah satu budak yang kemudian dimerdekakan oleh Sayyidina Abu Bakar radhiyallahu anhu. Akan tetapi pada akhirnya beliau menempati posisi yang sangat tinggi di dalam Islam. Sehingga karena pertama-tama dia dipilih oleh Nabi SAW untuk menjadi muadzin utama. Tentang dirinya Abu Hurairah mengatakan, nasa'tu yatiman wa hajartu miskinan wa kuntu ajiran libnati wazwan bi ta'ami batni wa uqbati rijli ahdu bihim idza rakibu wa ahtadu bihim idza nazalu falhamdulillahilladzi ja'ala ad-dina qiwaman wa Abu Hurairah imaman. Tentang dirinya sahabat Abu Hurairah radhiyallahu taala mengatakan, aku lahir dalam keadaan miskin, dibesarkan dalam keadaan miskin, dan kemudian hijrah ke Madinah dalam keadaan miskin. Aku adalah seorang buruh bagi seorang perempuan dengan imbalan yang cukup mengganjal perutku. Akan tetapi kemudian aku menempati posisi yang sangat tinggi, maka alhamdulillahilladzi ja'ala ad-dina qiwaman wa Aba Hurairah imaman. Segala puji bagi Allah ya, yang menjadikan agama ini sebagai tuntunan dan menjadikan Abu Hurairah sebagai imam, padahal dia adalah mantan budak hitam. Para hadirin sekalian, qala Sayyid Muhammad bin Anwi al-Maliki hakian an Bilal bin Rabah wa yaqulu wa hadhihi al-musawatu al-ijtima'iyyatu tabdu wadihatan fi katsirin min hikobi tarikhina. Khudh masalan rajulan ka Abi Hurairah, kaifa kana di Abi Hurairah al-ajiri al-miskini an yartafi'a ila hadhihi al-manzila wa ya ummul muslimin laula an sawal islamu ijtimaiyan bainan nas wa hadama al-fawariq at-tabaqiyya bihim. Bagaimana mungkin seorang Abu Hurairah, seorang guru yang sangat miskin, bisa menempati posisi yang sangat tinggi dan menjadi imam bagi kaum muslimin jika seandainya Islam tidak menjadikan kesetaraan sebagai prinsip utama di tengah-tengah manusia dan merobohkan seluruh al-fawariq at-tabaqiyya bainan nas. Selanjutnya beliau mengatakan tentang Abu Ali Ar-Rayahi, kana huwa abdan mamlukan limra'atin min Bani Riyah. Semula dia adalah seorang budak bagi seorang perempuan. Faqara al-Qur'an wa bara'a fihi, kemudian dia belajar Al-Qur'an dan mahir di bidang Al-Qur'an, hatta asbah la yujadu bainas sahabati man huwa alamu bil Qur'ani minhu, sehingga kemudian kecuali para sahabat tidak ditemukan orang yang paling alim di bidang Al-Qur'an daripada Abu Aliyah. Yuhaditsuna an nafsihi, dia bercerita tentang dirinya. Karena Abdullah ibnu Abbas yarfa'uni ala saririhi. Ibnu Abbas itu menempatkan aku di atas sarirnya. Wa Quraisyun asfalu minhu, sementara orang-orang Quraisy duduk lebih rendah daripada Ibnu Abbas. Kemudian ia mengatakan, faman aina li hadzal abdi an yartafi'a ala bani ammi Rasulillah sallallahu alaihi wasallam laula anna al-islam sawahu bihi. Bagaimana mungkin budak seperti Abu Aliyah bisa menempati posisi yang lebih tinggi daripada sepupu Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Ibnu Abbas tak lain karena Islam adalah menyatarakan di antara umat manusia. Wa annahu ja'ala lil alimi manzilatan laisa maslaha manzilatul hasab, dan bahwa Islam menempatkan orang alim pada posisi yang lebih tinggi dibandingkan orang yang punya nasab tinggi. Hawalas sahabatu an yasfa'u Usama bin Zaidin fi imra'atin min Quraisyin wa min Bani Makhzum saraqat fastahaqqat an yuqama 'alaiha haddus sariqati fakallamahu fiha Usama fawadhiba sallallahu alaihi wasallam ghadbatahu al-ma'rufah wa qala innama ahlaka man kana qablakum annahum kanu idza saraqa fihim asy-syarifu tarakuhu wa idza saraqa fihim ad-dha'ifu aqamu 'alaihi al-hadd. Wa aimullahi law sarqat Fatimatu bintu Muhammadin laqata'a Muhammadun yadaha. Ini contoh kesetaraan hukum, kesetaraan manusia di depan hukum. Aujaba al-islamu tabri'atal mazlum wa in kana kafiran wa idanatal zalimi wa in kana musliman. Islam mewajibkan agar supaya membela orang yang terzalimi meskipun dia kafir, dan mewajibkan menghukum orang zalim meskipun dia orang muslim. Anzalallahu subhanahu wa ta'ala al-ayata al-atiyata fi sadati tabri'atil yahudil mazlumi. Inna anzalna ilaikal kitaba bil haqqi litahkuma bainan nasi bima arakallah wa la takul lil kha'inina khasima. Ayat ini turun berkaitan dengan sebuah peristiwa pencurian. Pencurinya adalah seorang muslim yang bernama Tu'mah bin Ubairik. Yang dicuri adalah baju besi milik tetangganya. Akan tetapi kemudian baju besi itu disembunyikan di rumah seorang Yahudi. Akhirnya si Yahudi itulah yang dicurigai sebagai pencuri baju besi itu. Kemudian orang yang kehilangan baju besi tahu bahwa apa yang menjadi miliknya berada di rumah seorang Yahudi. Ia pun datang ke sana dan kemudian yang dianggap sebagai pencuri adalah si Yahudi itu. Sementara Tu'mah bin Ubairik dengan keluarganya mendatangi Nabi SAW menyampaikan bahwa Tu'mah bukanlah pencuri. Mereka menyampaikan argumentasi yang luar biasa dalam rangka membebaskan Tu'mah daripada tuduhan. Hampir saja Rasulullah SAW akan memutuskan bahwa si Yahudi adalah pencuri, sementara Tu'mah merupakan orang yang tak bersalah. Akhirnya turunlah ayat ini, ya. Wala takun lil kha'inina khasima. Janganlah kamu menjadi pembela orang yang berkhianat. Ya. Jadi kesimpulannya, meskipun Yahudi tapi dia tak salah harus dibela. Sebaliknya meskipun dia orang Muslim tapi dia bersalah harus dihukum. Ini. Kemudian hal yuktalu al-muslimu bi ghairil muslim. Bagaimana kalau ada orang muslim membunuh non-muslim? Apakah juga dibunuh sebagai hukuman qisas? Dhahaba ilal awwali al-imamu Abu Hanifah wa ilal tsani jumhurul ulama. Menurut Imam Abu Hanifah, benar-benar terjadi kesetaraan antara non-muslim, antara muslim dan non-muslim. Orang muslim yang membunuh orang non-muslim tetap harus diqisas. Sementara menurut jumhur ulama tidak diqisas. Ihtajja Abu Hanifah bi umumi qoulihi ta'ala kutiba 'alaikum al-qisasu fil qatla. Wahtajjal jumhur bima rawahu al-Bukhari anna an-nabiy sallallahu alaihi wasallam yaqulu la yuqtalu muslimun bi kafirin. Mu'taridina ala Abi Hanifah bi anna al-ayata makhsusatun bi hadzal hadits. Argumentasi daripada mayoritas ulama bahwa keumuman ayat kutiba alaikumul qisasu fil qatla ditaksis dengan hadis la yuqtalu muslimun bi kafirin. Wahtajju aidan bi qoulihi ta'ala afaman kana mu'minan kaman kana fasiqa la yastawun. Orang mukmin tidak sama dengan orang fasik. Fa innahu sarihun fi nafyil musawati bainal muslimi wa ghairil muslim. Ayat ini tegas sekali bahwa tidak ada kesetaraan antara muslim dan non-muslim. Wal musawatu bainal qatil wal maqtul syartun indahum liwujubil qisas. Sementara kesetaraan antara yang membunuh dan yang dibunuh merupakan syarat dilaksanakannya qisas. Sementara apa argumentasi daripada Abu Hanifah? Bahwa sesungguhnya ayat ini menyangkut persoalan keadilan di dunia dan merupakan kenikmatan nanti di akhirat, jadi tidak ada kaitannya dengan qisas dan lain-lain. Ya berdua anna madhabal jumhur aqwa fal amalu bihi ahwatu. Nampaknya pendapat jumhur dalam hal ini lebih kuat dari pendapat Abu Hanifah. Walakin qad ya'tari dzarfun yatatallabu al-akhdh bi madhhabi Abi Hanifah. Akan tetapi seringkali terjadi situasi dan kondisi yang menuntut kita berpegang kepada madhab Imam Abu Hanifah. kama fi hadzal asri fi dawli al-wataniyah al-qa'imati 'ala al-muwasawati bainal muslimi wa ghairihi. Meskipun pendapat Abu Hanifah ini dianggap pendapat yang lemah, akan tetapi menjadi pilihan pada saat-saat sekarang di mana negara hadir hampir seluruhnya merupakan negara bangsa yang dibangun di atas kesetaraan di antara seluruh umat manusia. Sekarang zawajul muslimah min ghairil muslim, perkawinan muslimah dengan non-muslim. Karena az-zawaju minal umuri al-muqaddasah wal asraril ilahiyah. Perkawinan itu adalah persoalan sakral ya. Wa min syurutihi an alla tatazawwaja al-muslimatu min rajulin masihiyyin aw ghairihi min ghairil muslimin. Salah satu syarat sahnya pernikahan dalam Islam, seorang muslimah tidak boleh kawin dengan laki-laki non-muslim. Wal kanisatu aidan yarfudu zawajal masihiyyati minal muslim. Gereja juga melarang seorang perempuan Kristiani kawin dengan orang muslim sama. Ufil umuri al-ilahiyya kullu diyanatin laha syurutuha allati la yaqbalu al-khalasu minha. Wala'alla min hikami an-nahi, barangkali salah satu hikmah kenapa ada larangan seperti itu, annal mar'ata fil adati tutabi'u zawjaha fi af'alihi wa tata'assaru bihi syari'an. Bahwa pada umumnya perempuan itu cenderung tunduk kepada sang suami. Wa minas sahli an taquma al-muslimatu bittiba'i zawjiha, dan sangat mudah seorang muslimah mengikuti agama suaminya. Sementara Allah Ta'ala berfirman, فَإِنْ عَلِمْتُمُوهُنَّ مُؤْمِنَاتٍ فَلَا تَرْجِعُوهُنَّ إِلَى الْكُفَّارِ. Kemudian al-wajibu al-mali nahwad daulah, kewajiban finansial terhadap negara. Apa ada perbedaan antara muslim dan non-muslim? Kanat az-zakatu faridatan min faraidil Islam wa ruknan min arkanihi. Tu'khadhu min al-awliya wa turaddu 'ala al-fuqara. Wa la tu'khadhu min ghairil muslimin li'annahum la ya'taqiduna wujubaha. Zakat tidak dipungut dari penduduk non-muslim karena mereka tidak meyakini wajibnya zakat. Bagaimana mungkin orang yang tidak punya keyakinan dipaksa untuk melakukannya. Wa fi ad-daulati al-islamiyyati tu'khadhu jizyatun minal muslimin min ghairil muslimin. Sementara di negara-negara Islam dipungut jizyah dari penduduk-penduduk non-muslim yang mampu. Walau tulibu minal imami, walau talabu minal imami annama ukhidha minhum ukhidha bismis sadaqati la bismil jizyat ujibu ila dzalika. Kalau orang-orang non-muslim keberatan apa yang dipungut dari mereka itu atas nama jizyah dan minta agar supaya atas nama zakat, ya tidak persoalan. Wala musyahata fihi. Faqad talaba nasara bani Taulib min sayyidina Umar radhiyallahu anhu an yaqbala minhum al-jizyata bismi sadaqati walau kanat mudha'afatan amma yata'uhu al-muslimuna. Nasara bani Taulib meminta kepada Sayyidina Umar agar supaya Sayyidina Umar menerima dari mereka jizyah, tapi bukan atas nama jizyah, melainkan dengan nama zakat, meskipun berkali lipat daripada zakat. Faqobila minhum, maka Umar pun setuju. Akan tetapi beliau mengatakan, haulai ham qaradu bil ma'na wa bau al-ismah. Mereka itu gendeng. Mereka itu mau dengan isinya tapi tidak mau dengan bungkusnya, ya kan? Ya. Hadai. Wa fi ad-dawlati al-wataniyah tu'khadhu daribatun min al-muwatinin al-musirin bila farqin bainal muslimin wa ghairil muslimin. Di negara-negara bangsa dipungut pajak dari warga negara yang mampu tanpa ada perbedaan antara muslim dan non-muslim. Wa 'alal muslimin duna ghairihim wajibun akhar wa huwa daf'u zakati bi janibi daf'i dhariba. Sementara warga negara muslim diwajibkan untuk membayar zakat yang tidak wajib dibungut daripada dari orang-orang non-muslim. Tinggal berapa menit? Ya? Iyalah. Oh, cukup. Saya tambah sebentar. Wal musawatu ka ukhtaiha al-adawati wal hurriyah yaqtadiha tahqiqul amni wal amani was salami. Wa hadha amrun daruriyun yarnu ilaihi kullu insanin fadlan an mu'minin yatanabbahu ila wajibihi wa wadhifatihi ka'abdin lillahi khalifatin lahu fil ardi idh la yastati'u al-mu'minu an ya'budu rabbahu wala an yu'addi risalatahu bituma'ninatin biduni amrin wa salamin wa qad da'a khalilu Ibrahim alaihi salam rabbahu an yaj'ala Makkah baladan aminan faqala wa idh qala Ibrahim rabbij'al hadza baladan amina. Mungkin ini dulu, masih separuh, cukup sekian. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Saya kira aplaus yang luar biasa untuk Pak Kiai Dr. Afifuddin Muhajir. Minta maaf Pak Kiai karena waktu kita sangat terbatas. Ladies and gentlemen, as we run out of the time, I may conclude that al-musawat bainan nas, seperti yang disampaikan oleh Pak Kiai, equal among humans, is evident in Islamic text. So it open us among Muslim to see, to identify whether general scope of ummah or hassa, and then we can analyze or understand Islamic text based of contextual or textual. Saya kira Bapak Ibu sekalian, karena kita once more, thank you so much for Prof. Masyud. Terima kasih, syukran katsira Ustaz Pak Kiai atas kehadirannya di tempat ini. Saya kira ini adalah hal yang luar biasa dan kami mohon maaf karena waktu kita tadi terlambat memulai, maka kita harus cut lebih awal karena ada lagi presentasi kedua ini dari presenter internasional. Sekali lagi terima kasih, big applause for the speakers. Makasih banyak dan kami tutup dengan ucapan Alhamdulillahirrabbilalamin. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam. Nashkur ila sadah al-Ustaz Dr. Mas'ud wa Syekh Afif ala hadhihi al-madah al-jayyidah la siyama fima yata'allaqu an ahamiyati istikhdamil maqasid kan nadhariyah fi tajdidil fiqhil islami lil buhuth anil huquq al-insaniyati wassalami wal musawati bainar rajul wal mar'ah. Ayyuhas sadah, nakhtul an ila takrimi al-hadaya allati sayaqumu bitaqdimiha Wakil Rais Jamiati Sunan Ampel Al-Islamiyah Al-Hukumiyah Al-Ustaz Dr. Muhid falyatafaddal bifadilatihi.